So as they say in Transylvania, good evening. My name is Warner Kionke, and by background I am a social worker. I am currently retired, but I also worked on the West Side for 20 years in mental health. I was a director of mental health centers. And as a result, I became very much exposed to the issues of the poor, etc., etc. I was born in Germany, that's why I've got the weird name. I was born in post-war Germany. My father spent a very brief period of time in a concentration camp when they were rounding up a lot of Germans to send to the Russian front in order to fight. My mother was working in a job in Germany, but then she assisted some of the Allied soldiers that were caught in as prisoners, and she was caught in that. So therefore she was to go on trial for assisting the enemy. She lost her job and so forth, and I've got that documentation at home. So as a result, when we came to this country, well, another little tidbit. When I was growing up as a little kid, because we came to this country when I was about 6 years old, and we lived in a town called Koblenz, which is along the Rhine River. And many times when you see the John Wayne movies, you see the soldiers passing out the Hershey candy bars to the kids. We got the candy bars from the African American soldiers. And therefore the white soldiers treated us as Germans and so forth, and so sometimes they weren't too nice to us, but the African American soldiers were generally nice to us, even befriending my family, where they would at times bring in food, etc., because this was right after the war. So when we came to this country, even though I was a small child at that time, I saw the segregation in this country, and therefore during the 60s, when I came of age, I got very much involved in the civil rights movement. My parents also worked with me a lot in terms of an anti-war movement, so therefore the Vietnamese War was going on at that time, and I obtained a conscientious objector and had to do 2 years of alternative service, and that's how I got involved with social work. And at that time I was also working on the west side of Chicago. So as a result, since that time I have been very much of a progressive, sometimes bordering on kind of a radical type of approach depending on what we were dealing with. I felt okay with a lot of the things going on with the conservative movement until Romney came aboard. Romney then started talking about the 47%, the moochers, the takers, and so forth. You saw a lot of that kind of discussion starting to go on in the Republican Party. And I'm not trying to make a generalization, but it's fairly common that people will talk about that. And therefore, at the time of Romney, I read this book on the conservative movement, and it really seemed to solidify for me a lot of the concepts that were going on in the conservative movement. I enjoyed reading it because it made me think a lot. So the name of the book is A Reactionary Mind, Conservatism from Edmund Burke to Sarah Palin by Corey Robin, who is in Poli-Sci at Oxford University. The first half of the book is about Edmund Burke, and he was an Irishman who wrote for the British monarchy at the time of the French Revolution. And much of the conservative movement was then based on the reaction to the French Revolution in an attempt to maintain the monarchy in England primarily. So therefore, many of the themes that are still present today are themes that were started at that time. However, if we want to begin just by highlighting the differences between the conservative and the progressive movement. We just need to look at the farewell addresses of Lyndon Johnson and Ronald Reagan. Lyndon Johnson, in his farewell address to the Congress, called for gun control and background checks. Ronald Reagan called for greater American pride and asked that we each need to define what it means to be an American. And I think that clearly delineates the differences. We're going to talk about that a little bit further. In terms of the French Revolution, what Burke was reacting to was that in 1789, the French Revolution developed a Declaration of the Rights of Man for each person living in France. There was also a removal of the liabilities against the Jewish people in France. In 1789, the French Revolution also called for the abolition of slavery. I'm sorry, that was 1791. The abolition of slavery and equal rights for the blacks in the colonies, with an abolition of the guilds and the monopolies that caused slavery to continue. Furthermore, there was an abolition of the nobility as well as titles, and also in 1791, the French Revolution brought about civil marriage and divorces. And as a result, that then became a very profound movement which dealt with issues of the church, the nobility, the ruling classes. When you're dealing with monopolies and you're dealing with employers that foster slavery and so forth, that is a part of what Burke was writing about. The other piece that is interesting within the conservative movement is that there is always a struggle going on. But the struggle is for those who are in the conservative movement, such as the Ryans of the world, and the people who are moving up. They always see the struggle as coming up from the people to attack this nobility and the stable form of government. That's one of the battles. We're going to talk about that further in a little while. Now, to get started, I'd like us to reflect on Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt was a man of privilege. Teddy Roosevelt did an extensive amount of writing in his diaries, and he was also educated in Europe. He spent some time there. He went to many of the European schools to get his education. He was also very much of a staunch conservative for the early part of his life. However, around 1900, he became the mayor of New York. During the time that he was mayor, Tammany Hall, which we've read about in the history books, was an organization that basically controlled the whole of New York City. Teddy Roosevelt had to get involved with the poor and address the poor, because there was abject poverty in New York City. At that time then, he tried to institute some programs to address the issues of education as well as poverty. Tammany Hall did not like that. Therefore, the Republicans made him a vice president and got him out of New York. However, what the Republicans did not count on was that McKinley would die in office, and as a result, he became the president, and he became a very progressive president. Where I'd like to start then with Teddy Roosevelt and the conservative movement, and also for us, is that being an old fart, I used to like the Rodgers and Hammerstein movies and musicals and so forth. And did anyone in here see South Pacific?
Yeah.
Okay. A very controversial musical for the time. And there is a song in that musical. It is called "You Have to Be Carefully Taught." Remember that?
Yeah, sure.
For us in this country, as well as other countries, we have to be carefully taught. Some of the things that we were taught in the 1800s was manifest destiny for the United States. Other things that we were taught is that democracy is the greatest form of government in comparison to other governments. One nation under God with liberty and justice for all. Unless when I came to this country in 1953, you were African American. Or many of the songs that we have gotten from England, from the United States, but for instance, God Bless America. We all know these songs. But with that, we also have a gradual introduction to the conservative philosophy. God, country, the Constitution, etc., etc. That's how we are all carefully taught. And therefore, at the end, I would like us to think about, and I would raise this challenge, if we consider ourselves to be progressives, how is it that we are taught to become progressives? We'll think about that. Okay, so briefly, what is a conservative? And this comes from the Wikipedia. It is the job of centralized government in peacetime to protect its citizens' lives, liberty, and property. All other activities of government tend to diminish freedom and hamper progress. The growth of government, the dominant social feature of this country, must be fought relentlessly. And that's an issue that we're dealing with right now. The history of the American conservative movement over the time has been marked by tensions and competing ideologies such as fiscal conservatives, libertarians, small government, lower taxes, secularism, school prayer, capital punishment, the support of Israel, an opposition to multiculturalism, the military, and also a form which is called godless communism. Those are all issues that we in our lives have addressed on some kind of a level. But these are terms that are not alien to us. You have to be carefully taught. And therefore, according to the conservative view, it goes back to the 1700s and is constantly responding to issues. It is a dynamic movement. It is not a movement that is stuck in 1700s and remains 300 years ago. It is a movement that is changing as the social situation changes, and we will talk about that further. It is a collective history. It is not just a history of a few, but it is a history of all of the people right now within the conservative movement. And what we are seeing is in the Republican Party. We have the Tea Party, we have the Libertarians, we have, the Ryans and his budgets, we have the issue of Medicare, we have the issue of health insurance, we have education, we have all of those things. It's a multifaceted party, and it's very complex, and what they're attempting to do is grapple with issues. In a few moments then we will flesh this out, but this is going to be a large umbrella that we're going to be working with. Also, according to the conservative movement, people interact on the basis of contracts. That's a key component. The contract defines what is to be expected in a relationship. Examples of contracts that the Republican Party and the conservatives are dealing with at this time are the role of husband and wife.
Absolutely.
Also, employer-employee relationships, the unions, etc. The citizenry versus elected officials.
Yep.
And these are some of the struggles that are going on within the conservative movement. However, when we take a look at unions or we take a look at employee rights, what we have is that model that we talked about before. The unions are coming from underneath, the employers who own the companies are coming from above, and that's where the struggle is coming from. We'll still talk about that further. Contracts also are freely chosen, and it is this idea of a freely chosen contract that we are going to get involved in a definition of what is freedom. And again, we will talk about that. However, there are consequences for the choices that we make.
That's correct.
Okay, so for example, in employment, this is a contract between an employer and an employee. The employer hires you, the employee says, I'm going to do this kind of work for you, I have these kinds of skills. Until the end of the 20th century, the courts tended to interpret the laws as virtually a form of servitude. The employers had many of the rights. And if we take a look at the struggles that occurred within our society, we take a look even at Haymarket, where you had union activists having a demonstration, and the police murdered some of the people in Haymarket. When you take a look at some of the other countries in this world, the movements for people come up from the bottom against this established order. In contrast, or in a contract, there is frequently a disparity of equality. The employer should be able to hire whoever he wants. The employee may not necessarily have that kind of a choice. If you were an employee for the streetcar, you were outside during the winter months, and in New York there were a number of streetcar drivers who basically froze to death, and because there were many people who were involved in poverty, they would just have people who would then be willing to become streetcar drivers. In Germany, outside of Stuttgart, there is this massive castle that was for a king and queen in the 1800s. That castle had centralized heating. The king and queen could entertain in there. However, with the centralized heating, those heating ducts periodically became clogged. People would send their kids through the heating ducts to unclog them, and sometimes they would die in there. However, the families then got so involved in this is the king and queen that they were able to say, yes, we will give our kid for this. Also, under Burke, when Burke wrote about the French Revolution, what he said is that there should be a limit to the amount that power is shared within a society. Women were not given the vote until the 20th century. The limitations of power. Blacks did not get voting rights until 1965. Limitations of power. There was the debate about landowners being able to vote as opposed to people who did not own land. That was a part of our constitutional debate. Again, the limit of the contract. And these have been debates that have gone on for a long period of time, and they are still plaguing, in many situations, the Supreme Court and many of the courts that are going on right now. The intimacy that is involved in a superior and someone of a lesser level, a subordinate, is something that is also a great degree of focus. So for instance, you have the slave and the slaveholder, the czar and the peasant, the nobility and the commoner. There is also the whole issue of a private life. To what degree does a government intervene in our private life? There are two authors who were defending slavery, and they wrote that slavery was the most intimate relationship that could occur within a society, because you had the power of life or death over that individual, but also they wrote that they were very fond of the Negro. This may be based, these concepts, which is what he points out in his book, these concepts may be based on either propaganda, delusions at times, or enforcement of a rule where both parties know how to interact with one another. That being carefully taught is how we become members of society. It is called socialization. We are taught a language that gives us a perspective of the world. We are taught a worldview such as democracy is a great form of government, etc., etc. This can also be in a delusional form where we talk about manifest destiny, and in the exploration of the western part of the United States, it was considered to be a hobby to go out and shoot Indians from the trains in order to settle the West. Goebbels, who was a general in Hitler's army, made a statement at one time, if you tell people a lie long enough, they will regard it as the truth. That is the propaganda. Burke told the Parliament that the French Revolution very much destabilized the society as a whole. And I don't know how much time you want, because I've got a bunch of readings, but basically, that's what he said. It's like the French Revolution destabilized everything because you got rid of the cardinals who owned land, the church owned land, the church could say things about people. You had the nobility, and then you had everybody else. In terms of the destabilization and of society as a result of the French Revolution, in the United States, we've been dealing with voting rights issues as class tensions from the founding of the United States to the 1960s. We're still dealing with who will vote today. There are a lot of voting restrictions that are starting to come about in many of the states. The libertarian, which is your Rand Paul view of society, is not necessarily a collection of people, but a hierarchy in terms of various groups. For example, the father governs the family, or the owner of a company versus its employees. Rand Paul at one time said that if a company owns a restaurant, the owner should be free to choose because it is his restaurant to serve who he wants to serve. And he believes that firmly. And I'm not going to argue whether or not that is right or wrong, but rather that is a part of the libertarian movement and also a part of this class distinction. The conservative, therefore, must always plead his case through an organized body of thought, such as the Heritage Foundation, the Republican Party, the Tea Party, and also religious groups, and also an interpretation of the Constitution and what that means. However, the role of the conservative, coming from this book, is, on being conservative, then, is to prefer the familiar to the unknown, to prefer the tried to the untried, the fact to mystery, the actual to the possible, the limited to the unbounded, the near to the distant, the sufficient to the superabundant, the convenient to the perfect, and present laughter to utopian bliss. That is the definition of being a conservative. You know what you've got and you're comfortable with it. You don't want to rock the boat.
No change.
There is change, because the conservative movement, later on we'll talk about it, always has a counter-revolutionary part of it. And Burke talked about that. So for instance, and I'm going to start going ahead, but Nixon...
Is it change in the going back?
It's a change to deal with the current situation. So for instance, right now the conservatives are dealing with the freedom of choice. That's a counter-revolution. They're dealing with the issue of religion, guns. Those are all counter-revolutionary types of issues in the conservative movement, because those have been things that have been integral to the society in the past and have for some reason gotten changed, which leads into the next definition of the conservative, is that the conservative tends to focus in on a loss of something that he or she cared for deeply. The conservative also, when you take a look at people like your Rand Pauls, the conservative regards himself or herself as very conscious and also very reflective. Conservatives will therefore take issues and they will run with them. And that becomes very important, because later on, we're going to be talking in a few moments, this leads to a need for education in order to become very reflective, very conscious in what you're doing. Whereas someone who is poor on the west side of Chicago is very much driven by their appetites, their dispositions, and there's not necessarily a looking for the future. Okay? That's the way the conservative views the world. The conservative also, according to Burke, defends order and hierarchy. And Burke even writes, when the multitude are not under the discipline of the wisdom of the expert or the opulent, they are not in a civil society. That comment may seem like it's something that is very amiss to us as a progressive group. However, how many of us are multi-million-dollar donors to the Art Institute of Chicago, the Symphony Orchestra, etc., which are all pieces of society that some of us may value. So therefore, if we are a progressive body, that's something that we need to deal with. The multitude are under the discipline or the wisdom of the expert or the opulent, and if that does not occur, they are not living in a civil society. This is a definition by Burke. Basically, the rich, the elite, the well-educated are the ones who govern society. They are the ones who are most capable of making
Sounds like
decisions.
anymore.
In the 1900s, what you had were your Carnegies of the world and so forth, who did a lot in terms of the democratic viewpoint, saying, you know, this is a very great country, because where else could you succeed like that? You know, even in our discussion nowadays, what we have is, you know, this is a country where people who pull themselves up by their bootstraps can succeed.
But that doesn't distinguish a democracy from a republic.
No,
A
but it...
Well, it sounds like an oligarchy.
And that, because here is Burke again. The conservative defends particular orders, hierarchy, often private regimes of rule, on the assumption that in part the hierarchy is the order. Order cannot be had, declared Johnson, who was another person at that time, but through subordination. For Burke, it was axiomatic that when the multitude are not under the discipline of the wiser, the more expert, the more opulent, they can scarcely be called a civil society. And it is the role, therefore, of the conservative to defend such orders. Moreover, the conservative invariably launches himself on a program of reaction and counter-revolution, often requiring an overhaul of the very regime he is defending.
It's not classist that somebody has to stay down here because they were once, their ancestors were slaves or indentured servants or whatever, but rather that the intelligent and the people with money and intelligence and knowledge and power must govern, because otherwise, if these people down here tried to govern, it would not be a civil society. That's
Right.
what I gather from Burke.
A quote to kind of summarize this came from Richard Nixon. When he was dealing with a civil rights issue, Richard Nixon said that there should be civil rights for Americans if they were born in Europe or come from the Judeo-Christian background.
I'm sorry, say that one
Isn't
more
that
time.
wrong? I never knew he said that.
Oh, when did he say that?
I never heard that.
That, I've got that, I can give you the quote. It was in one of the lectures that Nixon gave where
I never voted for Nixon, so.
Nixon said, what we're talking about, like with this disparity, is that in our background and what we talk a lot about, we talk about a lot of the Judeo-Christian background of this country, number one. Also, many of the people who are in this country identify themselves as coming from European nations.
Well, sure.
Nixon, therefore, in the 70s, said that civil rights should occur, but it should be occurring for those groups.
I don't know about
Quakers fall in that category? Or
This was even after the Voting Rights
kind of
Act.
like them to Mormons?
The Voting Rights
If he
Act-
made that statement in the 70s,
Mhm.
Wow, that's pretty
So,
appalling.
okay. So according to Burke, and going back to Burke, the capitalist then is the ruler of men because of the ability to dispose of property as he sees fit, but also members of a society, and in this capitalist society, it must be something that is earned. You have to work your way up into that.
and so forming a union is a way of earning your way up into some power.
But the union
So that
is
a
from the
conservative should be looking at unions as a good thing.
But currently, what we have in states such as Wisconsin, the unions for the conservatives are that counter-revolutionary aspect.
But then that kind of defies that,
Because
Definition.
a union does not have property to dispose of.
But
Well,
they-
it has tremendous property to dispose
yeah,
of.
they have,
All of its members.
Well,
right. That's a power issue.
But they
Absolutely.
don't hire people. They're not the workers, they don't,
They strike.
they
They
strike.
can control
control people.
their own destiny. Come on.
Right.
Get in there. What you're talking about basically is what went on 200 years ago. And if you look at America right now, we have, as somebody has mentioned, a black president, which is wonderful. We've had strong unions in the United States since Franklin
Although
Roosevelt.
that's declining now.
It's declining, but it's
been for
declining
years.
because we shipped all of the business to Asia and Mexico and elsewhere.
Just a
But
quick question, I mean, just, I know we're getting off track a little bit here, but how would you explain the increasing gap in the disparate income?
Well,
The
because
amount
of some very bad policies that have been enacted in Washington.
To summarize Burke, what he says is, unlike the revolutionaries who focus on the powerless, the French Revolution, the conservative asks people to do more of what they have always done. Okay. So therefore, to preserve the order, the nobility, things like that, to have people who can raise their kids to go into a castle and unblock a duct. Hobbes then also got involved in this. Hobbes defined in his works that there are always two players in a political theater, God and the king. Those are the two political players. The common person was governed by consent, and the state provided the common man with the space and security to live his life.
That's about accurate.
Space, but not security.
Security by the military
But that was
to
then.
ward off, other countries or so on.
Oh, okay,
Okay.
but not the security
Right.
from poverty.
No.
Hobbes then says there is a continual struggle between reason and passion. Liberty is the use of reason and the focus upon education, whereas the common person has passions which result in arbitrary decisions. Freedom, according to Hobbes, then, is dependent upon living in a government regardless of what form that the government takes. And we may find that really hard to believe. However, we put people into office, namely the Shah of Iran, and we supported him for quite a number of years. Pinochet, we went to Chile with Pinochet and gave him information on how to fundamentally govern his country.
Now, who's we that did
The
that?
United States.
I thought it was the copper interests.
Milton Friedman was the person who advised Augusto Pinochet in 1975.
Yeah, and how were the copper mining corporations here in the United States involved in that?
That I don't know. Also, in the Union of South Africa, Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, two conservatives, had their congresses write documents that they would support an embargo of the Union of South Africa because of the apartheid. Ronald Reagan vetoed that. And it was one of the only times that his veto was overridden by the Congress, because he felt that if you were to involve a discussion of apartheid or get involved in that, it would also then destabilize South Africa. But that is basically the history and the underpinning of the conservative movement. The very strong points of view that were taken by Hobbes, as well as by Burke, as a result of a reaction to the French Revolution. We're now going to take a look, after we have a little bit of discussion, questions, if somebody has to go to the bathroom, we always put that in there too. But, if you're not asleep by this point,
We're not.
then what we'll begin doing is taking a look at the transition of the conservative movement into the 20th century. So we should visit the Peabody Estate, which is located in Oak Brook.
I have.
Okay, in the Peabody Estate, there were several exits to the Peabody Estate because he paid everybody in company money and you could only buy from the company store.
Yeah, I know.
And the several exits were there because he feared for his life many times and he wanted to have a rapid exit. For people getting up in the world, we're going to jump ahead a little bit then.
Is that the same Peabody that ran coal mines in
Yep.
Yes.
And
Muhlenberg County? Same
in the
thing,
New
remember
York
that song?
Times for March the 8th, the Kansas School District went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court voted against the state of Kansas because there is a disparity of the amount of money that is given to richer school districts versus poor school districts. And Brownback, who was the governor of Kansas, just had a massive tax cut. However, the amount of monies that went to the richer school districts were not cut, and the money stayed the same for the poorer school districts. So the judge said that there should be no disparity in terms of funding of schools. Brownback is going to take that to the Supreme Court. I took a look at funding for school districts. The city of Chicago currently spends $7,946 per year per pupil. The village of Hinsdale spends approximately $19,000.
Wow.
Utah is the lowest in terms of how much money they spend for education, and that's $6,664. Mississippi spends $8,119, and the southern states tend to spend the least, whereas the highest is New York State, which spends $19,597. And I apologize for Hinsdale, I misquoted it. It's $16,865.
Still.
I wanted to just compare Chicago with Hinsdale.
It's up there.
So Chicago's in
Approximately
line
half.
almost with Utah, which
Yeah.
is the lowest.
Having been involved in like social legislation for most of my life, the person who brought about a change in Medicare with disability and so forth and made it a national program for disability assistance was Richard Nixon. Because the states were the ones who were complaining about how much money they had to pay for the poor. So Nixon made it a federal program as opposed to allowing the states to do it. And you still have a great degree of disparity among healthcare services for like poor states, but the Medicare program tends to equalize that on some level.
I have a
I
question.
have no idea, I
The
don't think so.
Republican
Yeah,
Party,
but
when Abraham
I don't know
Lincoln
when
was
that's occurred.
in power, was not the same Republican Party that we have today, is it?
Correct.
I mean, because Lincoln was looking to the future, and he was looking for, I mean, if you say they have to fight disparity, when he suggested the Emancipation Proclamation, everything was gonna blow up in his face, possibly.
Lyndon Johnson, when he signed the Civil Rights Act in 1964, 65, somewhere around there, 65, okay. One of the comments that he made at the time of the signing is that the Democratic Party will now lose the South virtually for a very long period of time.
And they did.
Because you had the Dixiecrats down there and the Republicans were somewhat more of your northern parties.
Yeah, the party's really flip-flopped in
Yeah,
so many ways.
yeah. The Democrats had the people down there in Roosevelt's era. That's one reason he had to go a little slower than he might have gone. He had to keep the party together. And some of those southern senators, as I remember, maybe you youngsters don't, but they were very powerful.
And interesting in terms of some of the comments.
And Eisenhower starting the federal highway system, you know, the interstate, I mean,
Yes, he did.
and the
And the GI
parties
Bill
have
and-
totally really flip-flopped, and
Eisenhower is not the Republican of this Republican Party. You know,
is
there is a
anybody from
change.
the past? Yeah, I don't.
We're going to talk about that in a few moments because the person who is transitional in the current neoconservative movement was Ronald Reagan. And we're going to talk about how he brought about a change and some of the things that Burke was saying, even though it's still built upon a lot of the ideas of Burke and Hobbes.
But wouldn't you agree that since I grew up in the 30s, we have had a gradual, slow, sometimes slowed down, but then moved forward, a gradual liberalization of the law. Obviously, the sins of the past as far as African Americans has been eliminated legally. Women have the right to vote. I mean, this is not the United States of 1900. It's not the United States, certainly, like Britain in 1790. We've come a long, long way. And the pressure in the last 80 years, 90 years, has been all, which I'm all in favor of, but it's to liberalize, to cut back all of the old garbage in this country. Am I crazy?
No,
I think that's absolutely
No.
true.
It's
I
just
think-
evolution.
I think that the one thing that still seems to me to be kind of right on all the way through with having Burke had those thoughts about governing by the more intelligent people and so forth.
Privilege.
I beg your pardon?
I just said privilege.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no matter how they got to that place.
Right.
And I think that our forefathers struggled with that, whether we would be a republic or a democracy. And I think that that's still, I still think that's one of the few things that has remained Republican in concept more. I think that the Republican Party today, and maybe I'm wrong, but I think the Republican Party today would still feel that way. And so the interesting thing is, much as they've flip-flopped and the ideology is all over the place, the Republicans still seem to me to favor more Republic style of government,
Yeah.
and the Democrats
Well,
still
when you
tend to
say-
favor more.
When you say that, are you using those terms the way I am, that a republic, the people vote to elect the government?
Right,
A democracy, a perfect democracy,
everybody votes the same.
well, no, in a perfect democracy, everybody would have an equal say.
Exactly.
But that can't be.
Right, but but in a pure sense, I just mean, I still think that the Democrats still favor that concept more, and the Republicans still favor the concept of privilege being
I think
more
of the
important.
Democrats as being more inclusive and the Republicans being more exclusive.
As far as governing, yeah, I mean,
Well-
on just
Okay.
on a purely ideological thing, not so much.
But you draw
how it's being
a
practiced.
distinction between a democracy and a republic, which I find rather,
In a republic, as you
Everybody
said,
votes.
people vote for electors, and then those people are the ones that make decisions, with the idea that the common man.
yeah, but how
who-
could everybody in the United States decide every issue that comes up?
In terms of voting rights, that's another one that I find interesting when I talk to conservatives, because to me, one person, one vote is very important. And this whole thing about Citizens United, where money is basically being considered speech in a way, to me, I have a big problem with that. And and your discussion here really kind of brings out where that's coming from, because to them, the more money you have, the more say you should have in government. And if you can't take a day off of work because you are not high enough on the food chain to be able to afford to take a day off of work, you shouldn't vote. You should not have,
That's Tuesday elections.
that's what's happening, that's what's happening with the voting rights, is that they're cutting back on weekends, evenings, holidays. You can't vote on weekends, evenings, holidays for voting early.
Yeah, but they're not saying that that is the pretense.
No, they're not, they're not,
never
but,
say that out.
but that's where that's coming from. They don't see that as a problem, they don't see that as a bad thing, because if you are not, if you're an hourly wage earner and you can't possibly take any time off of work, they're good with you not being able to vote.